Hi, we continue in Genesis 32 today as Jacob, terrified at the thought that his brother is coming with 400 men and expecting that means that Jacob and his whole family are at risk of being murdered, Jacob has prayed and pouring his heart out to whether it's Yahweh or Elohim, as we looked at last time, is not clear, or both. And now he's preparing to face Esau by sending him an enormous number of animals as a present. And one of the questions we have to ask at the beginning is, what is going on with Jacob that he thinks he can placate Esau with material possessions? It certainly expresses a view about Esau and perhaps of the Edomites and perhaps more broadly of the people of the land, that whether that's in the time of Deuteronomy and Joshua, as we'll see some connections with that, or at the time of Josiah and the late monarchy, or even at the time of exile, depending upon what previous context we think in biblical history is relevant for understanding our passage here, that foreigners and strangers are enemies that you should be afraid of. But spoiler alert here, as we'll see in chapter 33, Esau not only doesn't want any of it, he's offering Jacob peace on no terms other than I'm your brother and we'll make peace. So I'd like to suggest this is setting up a contrast between the religion of empire perspective in Deuteronomy Joshua, which sees the people of the land as an infection that must be destroyed, stayed away from, or destroyed, and there are many stories of that in Joshua, fulfilling what Moses is said to have told people on the edge of the Jordan before they crossed, a river that he didn't cross, and Genesis's exilic or post-exilic contrast to show a peaceful outcome. And notice that we've seen that kind of thing earlier around Bethel in chapter 28 when we looked at the Josiah reform, and Josiah felt the need to destroy any priest who was offering worship, even to Yahweh, that wasn't in Jerusalem. And yet we saw that, we heard in chapter 28, Jacob proclaims God was in this place, Bethel, and I didn't know it, the very place that Josiah felt the need to destroy. So whether it's late in the monarchy or looking back at the first crossing into the land, we can see Genesis is contrasting its perspective of peacemaking, as we saw with Laban and the Mesopotamians in the previous scene with the border covenant made between Jacob and Laban, with what we're going to see here. But Jacob's not there yet. His fear is operating on him, and so this is what he does. So to put some context, you can see on the right side of the screen, we're continuing in the second half of the Jacob and Esau story. We saw the first part there with the birthright and blessing, of course, and we're right here in chapter 32, and the Jacob and Laban part was in the middle. And I've been noting throughout this section, there are a number of little word plays, some of them obvious and some of them hidden. In our immediate passage here, we're going to see that Jacob spent the night, that we see in verse 13 here, and we'll see echoed down the other side. The word for spent has its root as Laban. It's another play on Laban here, as white. Laban played on white back in the previous scenes with the goats. And so that one's there. And then we see in the very next verse the 200 ewes are Rachel's, Rechelim here. And so he's sending 200 Rachels along with the 20 rams. And then we'll see the crossing of the Jabbok farther down in the next video, in the next scene. So our immediate scene today is this blocked area, which is a nice tight chiasm. And you can see how it is on the screen here, how it all matches nicely together. And I don't need to go through all the details of that. You can see some of it here on the right side of the screen, although there are more details that aren't necessarily based on key words that we can see there. And I have not seen many scholars find this chiasm, even though it seems pretty clearly there. And it fits between the ABA chiasm at the beginning of the scene and the other ABCBA chiasm in the scene of the wrestling. So the author has really structured this tightly together, as we see. So let's jump right into our scene. So as I noted, the spent the night here for Laban there, play on Laban. And night is also a theme. We're going to see night a number of times in our scene here. So we see night there and a couple times. That's part of the chiastic parallel as well. And he took a present. And the word for present here is minha. And we see that as a key word as well, as you can see on the right side of the screen. But there's going to be a little trick, because at one point, what's translated as present or gift in the new RSV is going to actually be barakah, the blessing, as Jacob tries to return the blessing to his brother. And so he took a present for his brother Esau, and notice he referred in the instructions to the servants, to Lord Esau. They referred to his brother Esau, and the narrator is showing his perspective here, that even though he's politely and deferentially referring to him as if he's an opposing warlord, as Lord Esau, speaking of himself in the third person as your servant, the reality is they're brothers. And then this very interesting litany of animals. And one might want to ask, why all the numbers? And honestly, I don't have an exact answer to that. We saw that the 400 men that Esau was bringing was parallel to David's 400 men. And David's 400 men were part of a larger group of 600 men, 200 left behind with the baggage as the 400 went to recover the things taken from Ziklag, as we saw the previous reference to that in 1 Samuel 29 and 30. And so I don't think that we can say the 200 ewes or the 200 goats are parallel to the men that David left behind. That's just a coincidence. But there is also a parallel with the question of crossing a river or a wadi or a stream using the same language that we'll find here farther down. So there may be a parallel there, although it's not very tight. And you notice the ratio here of 10 to 1 of female goats to male and 10 to 1 of female sheep to rams, but then curiously 30 camels and their colts with no male camels mentioned, 40 cows and 10 bulls, and 20 female donkeys and 10 male donkeys. What we see overall is plainly there can be more females to male, which of course at one level quietly validates, for people who are concerned, that the children of Israel, the eponymous ancestors of the tribes, come from one man and 4 women, matching, at least in ratio, the 40 cows and 10 bulls. But why 10 to 1 here, I don't know. Perhaps it's something about the ratio of how often they give birth. I'm not an expert on that, and I don't have an answer for that one. But it's interesting that it's all laid out here. On the other side of the chiasm, we'll see, as we can see here, that it's laid out. The people who are crossing over are laid out in detail too. So the 30 camels here, notice it's 3 times as many as Abraham sent with his servant to placate Laban back in chapter 24. And when Laban saw the camels, his Mesopotamian eyes saw that as blessing, that the enormous amount of wealth that 10 camels represented. When Jacob sent the message with the messengers, he didn't mention camels. As I noted in the previous video, he mentioned oxen. So now the camels will come as a big surprise, and 30 of them. That's just a huge amount. And we note that the 10 camels that the servant brought in the previous generation to become a bride price for getting Rebekah would have been left with Laban. And we saw no negotiations between Laban and Jacob about camels. So Jacob got the camels somewhere else, or there's another part of the story with Laban that isn't reported, but there they are. And then the cows and bulls and the donkeys. And it's quite a thing, 550 animals. And as you could see on the cover picture, which I'll put here, spacing them apart as we'll see described, and it would have been quite the entourage. So he delivered into the hand of his servants every drove by itself, or every flock by itself, and said to the servants, "Pass on ahead of me and put a space between drove and drove," or between flock and flock. So it's a rather stately procession. Jacob doesn't know how far they're going. The servants simply said Esau's coming with 400 men, but he doesn't know how far away they are or how long it will take for these flocks and their drivers to get to where Esau is, but off they go. A couple details of words, and he gave here rather than delivered in the hands of his servant. And the word for drove here, as you can see, is used a number of times. Why the New RSV translated it that way is not clear, because it's otherwise as flock. Used 4 times here and 4 times in chapter 29, worth going back to see briefly, because this is the scene of the flocks at the well where Jacob meets Rachel. And so recalling that story of the flocks at the well where the shepherds there said they could not take the stone off the well until all the shepherds came and brought their flocks. So recalling the initial scene where he met Rachel there. And we don't see how many flocks there are. It's described each by itself, and that could suggest that each kind of animal formed a different flock. As we note below, he gives instructions to the second, third, and all. So it's an indeterminate number. It's certainly more than 3, and suggesting that the 5 kinds of animals are each in their own flock going by themselves. And so he said to the servants, using the Hebrew word, as we noted earlier, is 10 times in this passage, and you see a number of times there, cross on or pass on ahead of me, and put a space between drove and drove, or between flock and flock. So highlighting the crossing over, the Hebrew word, as I noted, but also a number of implicit echoes of the crossing of the Jordan in Deuteronomy, Joshua, and putting this as a counter story to that. Even though they're crossing the Jabbok, in the previous scene in the prayer, Jacob had said to God, this very Jordan that I crossed over and became 2 companies. So that reference was explicit there, but now it's about the Jabbok. And so, and put a space, Revok, only here and one other time in the Hebrew scripture. And now he gives these instructions. And last time he didn't give any instructions about what to do if Esau says anything. But now he has 3 very specific questions that he provides a very specific answer for. So he instructed the foremost, or the first here, Harishon, and we'll hear that again in chapter 33, 10 times in Genesis. When Esau, my brother, notice my brother, not Lord Esau, meets you and asks you 3 questions. To whom do you belong? Where are you going? And whose are these ahead of you? Obviously referring to the animals, or more literally, before your face, as the translation has over here, as you can see. pass on before my face, and who are these before your face, face being such a key theme, and you can see the parallels chiastically there around the center. And so who are these ahead of your face? So three good questions that Esau would have, although since the messengers from Jacob had already come, it shouldn't be too surprising that they're Jacob's, although we don't know how much time has passed since we heard that Esau was on his way. And as we noted in the previous, a long way, if he's down in Edom somewhere, a long way to get up to the Jabbok. Then you shall say in response, they belong to your servant Jacob. Notice not your brother Jacob, your servant Jacob. They are a present sent to my lord Esau. So the servant and lord language that we see there. And moreover, or the better, Vehenna, which is the word here in Hebrew, and behold, which for whatever reason no RSV never translates as and behold, and softening the exclamation mark there. And behold, he is behind us. So they're to say that after they see this whole sequence of flocks of animals and their drivers, that Jacob is coming behind. But notice he still doesn't mention the families, the 11 children and the 4 women, which he has to dispatch as well. So he likewise instructed the second and third and all, as I noted, and you shall say the same thing. Make it very easy to see the chiastic parallels, since it's the same instructions and saying to say the same thing when you meet him here, or literally when you find him here. And that's parallel to 32:5, as we heard earlier about if Jacob says, if I find favor with him. So Jacob seeking to find favor, and the messengers seeking to find Esau, which shouldn't be as hard the second time. They found him easily enough the first time. But then he adds a further statement, and you shall say, moreover, your servant Jacob is behind us, for he thought or said. And this is a wonderful image here that the New RSV just simply botches, and I can't understand why. So here you can see it on the right side of the screen, exactly what's going on. For he thought, I may appease his face with the present that goes ahead of my face, and afterwards I shall see his face, and perhaps he will accept my face. Now that's awkward writing in English, but not in Hebrew, where it's highlighting exactly what's going on, and it's all completely lost in the New RSV. Let's see how each detail matters. I may appease his face. So he's expecting that Esau's face will reveal anger, and he's hoping this present will literally wipe the anger off Esau's face and give him a more hospitable face that goes ahead of his face. So Jacob's not yet ready to face his brother. He has to face him indirectly through the servants and all these animals until he's able to face him directly. But afterward, I shall see his face, and perhaps he will accept my face. In other words, that we will be reconciled. And this is very important to the interpretation of the next scene, which, not to jump too far ahead, we can see down here, Jacob called the place Peniel for saying, I have seen God face to face, and yet he'll tell Esau in chapter 33 when they meet, to see you, your face is to see the face of God. And so leaving all this out here removes the possibility of really understanding clearly of the deliberate ambiguity of what's going on in the question of wrestling. Because as we'll see, many scholars say definitively he was wrestling with God, which is certainly not definitive at all. That's just an assertion that does not take account of all the evidence, as we'll see. It's deliberately ambiguous and invites us, as so much of the Hebrew Scripture does, to interpret it on multiple levels so we can see it works well on multiple levels rather than reducing it to an answer. As I've noted in the introductory video to this section, that's often a function of how interpretation of Scripture developed in Christian circles right from the beginning, based on philosophical grounding in Plato and Aristotle, differently from Jewish interpretation as it developed in Midrash, which is much more conversational and open-ended, and also more fun, in the sense it's not a heavy academic exercise, but one that has a certain amount of joy and playfulness in it, using plays on words and other expansive and imaginary elements. So all about the face here, and we'll see how that fits in when we get to the next scene and the reconciliation. So now the present passed on ahead of him. Notice, as if it's a third hand, something like the ark moving by itself in the beginning of 1 Samuel, although it's obviously not moving by himself. He's got servants on each, guiding each flock. And he himself spent the night in the camp, framing the chiasm there. But it's not over. That could be the end of it, but of course he has to deal with the family. And so let's go down a couple of more verses to see the end of our scene. And note that the women have no role here. And Rachel and Leah have not been passive. We saw in the earlier chapters around childbirth that they saw Jacob basically as the sperm donor, and they fought with each other over access to Jacob, etc., and rivalry. And we saw that Rachel had thought that she successfully wrestled with her sister in giving birth to her first child, Joseph. But they have no role here because this is about Jacob and Esau, even though it's their safety that's at risk. And notice how when it was a question of leaving Laban, Jacob took Leah and Rachel aside away from Laban and discussed the whole thing with them and got them to agree with him. But here it doesn't operate at that level. It's just him doing it. We don't know if they're happy with this or not. We don't know what the children are feeling. The children of various ages, some of them, as Jacob will argue, at least say to Esau in front of the children, they're small and frail and can only walk slowly. But some of them are certainly teenagers by this time. We don't know what their feelings are, how much they understand of what's going on. And obviously the children have never met their uncle Esau. So that same night, in the middle of the night, he got up and took his 2 women and his 2 secondary women, as I translated here. Maids is just not right there. They're not maids. They're the mothers of some of his children. So, and wives, as I've noted many times throughout the Hebrew scripture here, there's no word for it in Hebrew. So really it's the 2 women and the 2 secondary women and his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. Notice how, again, that's parallel to the crossing of the Jordan. But the ford of the Jabbok, Ma'avar here, only here in Genesis, once in Samuel and once in Isaiah. Here are a couple of images of that. But notice that he calls it, in this next verse, what's translated as a stream, Hanachal here, but the Brown Driver Briggs Lexicon refers to that as a torrent, or, quote, rushing water in a narrow channel, or water bursting from a rock. It's translated otherwise in the New RSV as brook, or wadi, or valley, and wadi suggesting like something we have in the U.S. desert Southwest, something that's dry in the dry season but can flood rapidly when the rain comes, and the environment here is not that different. So it may be that, but as you can see from these pictures of the low level of water in the Jabbok in different situations, and I don't know what time of year these pictures were taken or how much it varies in different times of year, going in the middle of the night with the 4 women and the 11 children and crossing, that would be quite an act in the dark. So they're doing it in the dark. The sun has not shined on him yet. So he took them and sent them across, and he doesn't go. He passes them along in the stream, as I noted, and likewise everything he had. And so we're going to see Jacob is now stripped naked. He's lost everything, at least temporarily, his women, his children, his flocks, and everything, and he's left alone to consider what to do when he faces his brother. But meanwhile, someone is to come in the middle of the night and jump all over him. And we'll see what happens with that mysterious scene next time. See you then. Bye-bye.